I want to orient us to what we're doing. We are now in the second unit of this class. So the first unit was soil properties. We really talked about what soil is, physical, chemical properties. Now we're talking about what happens in soil, dynamic things. And the first week of this unit was about a really important chemical process in soils, the most important chemical process in soils, cation exchange or ion exchange. Last week was about an important physical process in soils, soil water movement. And this week is all about soil biology. In fact, next week is also about biology. So we're spending 2 weeks talking about biology because it is so important. Biological processes in soil are so important. So this week, the first lecture was really about understanding the soil food web and the diversity of life in soils. Soils are the most diverse environments on Earth, especially from a microbial perspective. They are incredibly diverse. And so understanding that diversity and then the food web that it drives is really important. And so that's what the first part of this week's material was. And the second part is then taking that knowledge of biological activity in soils and applying it to the cycles of two really important elements, especially from a soils perspective, and that those are carbon and nitrogen. So the second piece was nitrogen cycles and carbon cycles. So I just want to go over a few key points. I'm going to highlight some things on the nitrogen and carbon cycles here. I'm going to share my screen. Take a second to pop up. So in your handouts, there are diagrams of the nitrogen cycle and the carbon cycle. They're the same ones I showed you in the lecture videos. And full disclosure, they're my diagrams. I think they're pretty awesome, but doesn't mean they're the best. There are other diagrams out there, certainly of the soil carbon cycle. Some are more complicated, some are less complicated. I tried to hit a balance between showing a lot of the different processes that happen, but also not overly complexifying it. So I'm going to just kind of walk through this to recap it so that we're all sort of on the same page. So most of the nitrogen in our world, always do that. Sorry about that. Most of the nitrogen in our world is in the atmosphere as dinitrogen gas, N2 gas. And that molecule is very stable and largely inert. There's a triple bond that brings the two nitrogen atoms together, and it doesn't react with a lot of stuff. So the interesting thing about nitrogen, it is literally the most limiting nutrient to plant and animal growth worldwide. And yet we're swimming in a sea of it. The air around us is over 75% nitrogen, and we can't use it. So in order for nitrogen to be usable by organisms, the nitrogen that's in the atmosphere to be usable by organisms, it has to be transformed into usable forms that organisms can then incorporate into their structures. So the first step of the terrestrial nitrogen cycle, is how that nitrogen gets from the atmosphere, it's dinitrogen gas, into solid forms in plant tissues and then maybe animals and eventually the soil organic matter. And that process is called nitrogen fixation. It's a biological process. There are microbes, both free living and symbiotic, that actually do this, and they use the enzyme nitrogenase to break the triple bond of nitrogen and then take that free nitrogen, that reactive nitrogen, and incorporate it into their organic molecules, their structures, amino acids, proteins, etc. And when they die, when those organisms die, their residues become part of the soil organic matter. So this RNH2 here, it just means all the organic molecules that you could possibly have in soil, right? So we're just talking about soil organic matter. It's a solid, and some of those organic molecules contain nitrogen. A lot of them do. The vast majority of nitrogen in a soil is actually in the soil organic matter in organic form. And it takes microbes decomposing that organic matter to actually release the nitrogen into a plant available form. And that process is called ammonification. So what happens when microbes decompose the organic molecules that contain nitrogen, they cleave off these nitrogenous groups, and release ammonium, ending in um, and that's a dissolved ion. That AQ just means aqueous. It's in solution. It's in the soil solution. So this is ammonium, and ammonium is a cation. And so that means that ammonium can participate in cation exchange with solid particles, clays, and organic matter that are negatively charged. And we haven't talked about ammonium as a major soil cation. It's not part of our big eight because it tends to be a lot lower in concentration than the other big eight cations, but it is a cation that can occur in soil, and it's obviously really important from a fertility perspective. This process is also known as sometimes mineralization, because you're going from an organic form of nitrogen in the soil organic matter, to an inorganic form, used to be called mineral forms. It's not mineral like, you know, our phyllosilicate or our soil minerals, but it just means an inorganic form. So from organic to inorganic forms, that process is ammonification or mineralization. Once that nitrogen's in the form of ammonium and in the soil water, it can actually interconvert abiotically to ammonia, which just ends in an A, and that's a gas. And ammonia can actually be volatilized and lost from the soil. It can be diffused upwards through the soil. And the conditions that favor this are high pH and dry conditions are what favor ammonia volatilization from ammonium. If you have wetter conditions, lower pHs, then that conversion doesn't usually happen, and most of that ends up staying as ammonium. Okay, the next step in the nitrogen cycle is called nitrification. This is the oxidation of that ammonium, and there's microbes. Again, remember, key point is every step we've talked about so far, besides the conversion from ammonium to ammonia, but all the major arrows are microbial processes. These are driven by biology. And there's a whole suite of microorganisms that make their living by oxidizing ammonium to nitrate. So this happens in an aerobic environment because you're adding oxygens to that nitrogen. So it went from a reduced form to an oxidized form. And nitrate is an anion. So unlike ammonium, which is a cation, nitrate does not interact with negatively charged soil particles. It's much more vulnerable to leaching down through the soil with water. So nitrate moves around a lot easier with the soil water. And this is why when we think about nitrogen, elevated nitrogen in surface waters, waterways, groundwaters, almost always it's nitrate is the thing, because ammonium tends to stick around in the soil because it's positive, it's a cation, it's positively charged. So nitrate can be lost by leaching. If there's water moving down through the soil profile, the nitrate can move with it. Okay, and then the next step back up to N2 gas is denitrification. This is an anaerobic process. So unlike nitrification, which is aerobic, denitrification is anaerobic. And this predominantly happens in wetlands. It happens in soils that have low oxygen content, basically. Okay, so those are the main fluxes. All of these things, again, are biological. This nitrogen fixation, ammonification, nitrification, denitrification, they're all biological processes. The exception is ammonium to ammonia, which is abiotic. And there's two other arrows that I haven't drawn here. There's lightning. So lightning actually has enough energy to split the triple bond of nitrogen. And when that happens, the dinitrogen is converted to nitrate. And it can be deposited by rain or dust on the Earth's surface. But generally speaking, that process is much, much lower in magnitude, like 10 to 100 times less than biological nitrogen fixation. So by far, most of the nitrogen that enters the terrestrial biosphere is entering through biological nitrogen fixation. Very small amount is entering through lightning action. But that's just to mention that it's a process that happens, even though it's less important in magnitude, it is still a thing. And the other thing I want to just mention is that those two plant available forms, nitrate and ammonium, they enter the soil solution, and that's where they can be uptaken by plants, or they can be uptaken by microbes and incorporated into microbial tissues, because microbes need nitrogen too. So once they're in the soil solution, they're available to be plucked up by organisms and incorporated into proteins, amino acids, etc. And the last arrow that I didn't highlight yet is the Haber-Bosch process. So the Haber-Bosch process is what we do as humans, taking dinitrogen gas out of the atmosphere and converting it directly to ammonia. So this is an industrial process. It occurs at very high temperatures and pressures. It's very energy intensive. And what you get is ammonia. That ammonia can then be used in different forms as fertilizers. So most of our fertilizer, if you go out and buy a fertilizer in the store that contains nitrogen in it, it actually came from nitrogen gas in the atmosphere and was converted to ammonia and then later converted to other forms of nitrogenous fertilizers. And so the Haber-Bosch process is really the major human impact on the nitrogen cycle. And we've essentially doubled the amount of nitrogen entering the terrestrial biosphere compared to pre-industrial activities through the Haber-Bosch process. We do make a lot of nitrogen this way. That nitrogen can have some benefits and some drawbacks. So the benefits are that that nitrogen is used to improve crop growth. The drawbacks are that there are environmental consequences to overapplication of nitrogen in some cases. And so eutrophication of surface waters, groundwaters, those types of environmental consequences are a result of too much nitrogen in the terrestrial biosphere. So balancing those benefits and drawbacks is a difficult thing. And it's the thing that a lot of research is focused on. How do we use nitrogen in a smart way at the right time without having these environmental consequences? So that's the nitrogen cycle. The carbon cycle, you'll notice, is much less complicated because there's only a couple major flows in the carbon cycle. So carbon dioxide is the main source of the carbon that eventually becomes soil organic matter, and that's brought into the terrestrial biosphere by photosynthesis. We've talked about this in previous lectures. And once those plants die, that carbon becomes part of the soil organic matter. Again, this RCH3 is just all soil organic molecules. It's just organic matter, right? All the organic molecules in the soil that contain carbon. And then that is lost from soil through respiration, microbial respiration. So basically, those are the two main fluxes: CO2 in to become soil organic carbon, soil organic matter, and respiration out to go back to CO2. There are a few minor arrows that I have here. So obviously biomass burning, if you burn the biomass before the plant tissues can actually make it into the soil, obviously there will be less carbon organic matter available to go into the soil. Also in dry or semi-arid environments, carbonate accumulation can occur. And that carbon that accumulates as carbonate, calcium carbonate or lime, is actually originally from the atmosphere as CO2. And it occurs when the carbonic acid in the atmosphere dissolves in water. That water evaporates, combines with some of the cations in the soil water, just like it would if evaporated on the surface of your stove. And you're left with this solid salt, lime. If carbonates dissolve, that carbon can return to the atmosphere. So in natural soil, if the climate changed over a long period of time and it became wetter, some carbonates could dissolve that would release carbon back to the atmosphere. You guys actually did this in your lab a couple of weeks ago. You actually took some vinegar and applied it to a calcareous soil, and you saw some fizzing. That fizzing is actually the carbon that was in the lime, in the solid lime, that inorganic carbon being released back to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. So let's see, what's the last one? Oh, last one is that in wetland soils or anaerobic soils, microbial respiration typically leads to methane and not carbon dioxide under anaerobic conditions. So that's a much more minor process than aerobic respiration on a global scale, but it's certainly an important process as well. And obviously humans have a major impact on the carbon cycle. So, we, through fossil fuel combustion, add a lot of carbon to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, but we also tinker around with photosynthesis and respiration because a lot of human activities result in land use and land cover change. So anytime we're changing a plant community, land use, land cover, we're changing photosynthesis, we're changing microbial respiration, the soil conditions, we're kind of tinkering with the carbon balance in a soil. And so there's a lot of research that's gone into showing how soil carbon changes with land use change. So the point is human activities have a major impact on the cycles of both carbon and nitrogen. Okay, so now what you're gonna do is I'm gonna reshare. If you go into your collaborative documents, you should see this at the top. It says nitrogen cycle. You only have a doc, there's no slide. And the fun thing about today is I've got a puzzle for you. So here's how this works. We're gonna pretend that we can tag a nitrogen atom, a single atom of nitrogen, and that we can follow it through the nitrogen cycle, the form that it's in, and even track the geographic location that that nitrogen atom is in. So we're following a single nitrogen atom. And so I've got here listed some events. So here's event 1, March 31st, 2018. The form was as dinitrogen gas, and it was in air over a grassland in a storm in Sibley County, Minnesota. The next day, April 1st, 2018, that same nitrogen atom was now in a nitrate molecule, NO3 minus, in the soil solution of an A horizon in a grassland in Sibley County, Minnesota. So it went from the air to the soil, and it went from dinitrogen to nitrate. So what I've got on the next page, and what you might want to do is open another tab like I have here, or maybe put another window side by side so you can put these things side by side. But if you go down from this first page, you'll find these lists. And these lists are the letters that I want you to enter into those boxes that match how these change form and change location. So for example, going from 1 to 2, we went from N2 gas to nitrate. There's only one process. You should also probably have the nitrogen cycle diagram up with you when you're looking at this. There's only one process that does that, and that's lightning. So lightning abiotically can convert N2 to nitrate. And so if I look at my list of possible forms here, K says abiotic N fixation by lightning. Okay, so I'd put K in that box, and I would check this off because these are only going to be used once. So this is kind of the puzzle. You'll know if you've gone astray if nothing fits in the boxes you have left. And then if I look at how nitrogen changed location, so we started with N in air over a grassland in a storm. We ended with nitrogen in a soil solution of an A horizon. And so if now I have a list of locations, these are all the ones you'll use there. And there's one here that says S, fell to earth via rainwater during a thunderstorm. So S is the best choice for here. So I'd have K in this box and S in this box. Okay, and then you do the same now. You go, okay, so now from 2 to 3, pick the best way it changed form, best way it changed location. Okay, and then the carbon cycle, I have another one for the carbon cycle. Same thing, we follow a carbon atom. Note that the dates are very different here. This was really fun to put together. So this carbon atom tracking starts on May 1st, 1156 AD. And our carbon atom, you'll see if you really get into this, is going to get inhaled by a bison, exhaled by a bison. It's going to end up in the soil organic matter. It's going to go back up to the atmosphere. It's going to end up as part of a leaf in a forest and then in the soil organic matter. I want you to conceptualize the incredible complexity of the flows of these elements around us. This is all happening all the time. These atoms, these elements are constantly changing form and location, and these are the cycles of nutrients that we live within. So anyway, so the carbon cycle, the dates are real, and they end actually in 2020. We start in 1156 AD. And then I also have a form and location list here. The difference with the carbon cycle, because there's fewer arrows, is that some of these are used multiple times. And if they're used multiple times, I actually told you exactly how many times they're used so that you can track and make sure that you're using them the right amount of times. Okay, so Hava will throw us into breakout rooms.